Now, today many campaigners on both sides of the debate were anticipating a decision from the government on gay marriage. But the decision turned out to be not to make a decision. A cabinet committee is to study some of the details. But is that the real reason for the delay? Here's Jamie McIver.
For gay men and lesbians, the road to equality has been a long one. A slow series of changes in the law and the evolution of public opinion means equality has never been closer. Against this, for supporters and opponents of same-sex marriage alike, waiting another couple of weeks or so for a cabinet decision may seem inconsequential. But some were genuinely disappointed there was no decision today. Jay and Ruth Richards-Hill live in Scotland but got married in South Africa.
The message that everybody was getting, and thus the great interest that's been displayed throughout the course of today and since yesterday, was that we would have an announcement. And we've been kind of getting these hints that, oh, we'd have an announcement in the early spring, and then it would come again, and yet again it hasn't happened. And personally, my message to the SNP is you're going to lose votes, not only for the people who are for equal marriage, but for the people who are against it, simply because an indecisive politician can't be trusted.
That allegation of indecision is denied by the government, which gave a clear indication of its thinking when it opened a consultation last year. Then it said it tends towards the view same-sex marriage should be introduced. The bulk of MSPs support gay marriage, though even within the SNP ranks, some have reservations. John Mason wants to ensure there are effective safeguards to make sure there's no chance of any faith group being forced to carry out same-sex marriages.
One of the assurances that has been given is that the churches will be protected and not forced into conducting same-sex marriages if they disagree with that. And there has been some question as to whether that could be produced. And so if they're looking at that in more detail, that's extremely good news.
77,000 responded to the government's consultation, and critics question polls which appear to show a majority of the public supporting same-sex marriage. Yesterday, the Catholic Church called for a referendum. Today, the government made it 100% clear that would not be happening. Now, that could be called decisive government, but political opponents don't see today's actions that way.
Government is about taking hard decisions, and it's been pretty clear in this debate that there are strongly held views on both sides. There's a level of public interest in this decision, but ultimately it comes down to ministers and to the Cabinet to get around the table to discuss the issues and think about what principle they want to set out, and then the detail of how they fulfil that principle. And on that test, the Cabinet today seems to have failed.
The problem for the government is that some were expecting a decision at today's Cabinet meeting. The risk is a delay may be perceived by critics as a sign of weakness or indecision. Same-sex marriage is an issue with little room for compromise, so when that decision finally comes, campaigners on one side or the other are bound to be very angry or upset.
Well, we did ask to speak to Nicola Sturgeon, the Minister who is chairing the Cabinet Committee looking into the details of the bill, but she wasn't available. I'm joined now from Edinburgh by the Deputy Editor of The Scotsman, Peter McMahon, and Magnus Linklater, columnist on The Times. Magnus Linklater, what do you think's going on here?
I quite like the BBC reporter who earlier said that the SNP government was suffering from pre-wedding nerves. It's not surprising, perhaps, that they're hesitating because they're between a rock and a hard place, aren't they? On the one hand, if they go ahead, they're going to run into the mighty opposition of the Catholic Church, and if they don't, then they run into the opposition of what seems to be a growing body of public opinion.
Sure, but do you think there are specific issues here? I mean, it's quite striking the Lord Advocate's going to get involved in this. I mean, do you think there are legal issues which they are trying to sort out here, for example?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, there is obviously the threat that if you allow some churches or teachers or groups an opt-out clause, as it were, that you're not forcing them to approve gay marriages in churches, then that might be open to challenge under the European Convention of Human Rights. But to be honest, I think that's quite a remote possibility. I doubt if this Cabinet Committee is going to come up in the end with that as an insuperable opposition. I think in 2 weeks' time or whenever it is, they'll say, right, we're going to go ahead.
Peter McMahon, what do you think this is all about?
I think there's some politics involved. Magnus is absolutely right. The Catholic Church, apparently anyway, is very powerful. The SNP are not the first group, first politicians in Scotland to have run across and incurred the wrath of the Catholic Church. It happened to Labour over abortion. It happened to them over Section 2A as well. So I think there's a reluctance to be seen to be in conflict with a major church, which has a lot of people following it.
Sure, but if they're going to come out in favour of this in 2 weeks' time, it doesn't really make any difference, does it?
Well, no, and that's also quite that's why I think the charges of this government not being terribly decisive is important. Nicola Sturgeon is at the heart of this. Is normally extremely a decisive minister. Health issues, you've seen her out and about. If health boards are in trouble, getting involved, Legionnaire's disease, whatever it happens to be. If you look at the consultation document, the issues that they are supposedly looking at now in this subcommittee were raised right at the beginning last September in the consultation document, whether or not churches and the celebrants, as they're called, ministers, priests, would be forced to marry people of the same sex if they didn't want to. And they've known about this issue for a long time, and if this is what's been looked at, including by the Lord Advocate, it's rather surprising that they're having to do it now.
Yeah, Magnus Linklater, would what David Cameron is proposing for England, which is that you have gay marriage but only in registry offices, not in churches, does that get round? And I know people might have strong views on whether that's a good idea or not, but does it get round some of the legal problems that you're raising?
It might get around the legal problems, but I doubt if it would get around the moral problem, and this is really what the issue is now, is that there is a strong body of opinion. It's a sort of logical progression from civil partnerships to having full marriage in church. And what you've just described is a kind of halfway house. I doubt if that's going to satisfy anyone, certainly not those who are campaigning for gay marriage in church.
Well, because the other problem, Peter McMahon, is presumably the legal framework governing this stuff it's not devolved, is it?
Well, some of it isn't. The equality legislation isn't, and that is one of the issues that those who are against same-sex marriage argue could intervene, that there could be some legal challenge. But again, you've got the Lord Advocate and other senior legal officers who advise the Scottish Government. People who are campaigning on this, the equality networks, for example, say that this isn't going to be such a big problem. And really it's more, I think, surely from the SNP point of view, they talk about building a new Scotland, about a more tolerant Scotland, perhaps a more liberal Scotland. It seems to me that to get into the legal nitty-gritty is to kind of lose the argument a bit. What this is about is what kind of Scotland do we want to build, and what kind of Scotland do they want to build? And that's why it's a bit strange that the SNP have taken the attitude they have.
Well, it's that strangeness, Magnus Linklater, I'm trying to get at. And the reason I raised this issue about devolution of the legislation, I mean, would one possible way out of this be for them to kick it into touch by saying, well, look, there would have to be changes to the governing legislation. That's not a devolved issue. We can't do that. We will happily introduce this as soon as the British government makes these legal changes.
But wouldn't that sound incredibly weak for an SNP government, which is committed to a Scotland which makes its own decisions? I think that the real risk of this delaying tactic is that it plays into the hands of those who are already accusing Alex Salmond of running scared of a number of issues like, I don't know, NATO, Euro, all the various problems associated with independence. Here is yet another one which is within his competence to introduce, and he seems to be backing away from it.
Okay.
That's what the problem is.
All right, Lou, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed. Quick look at tomorrow's front pages, starting with the Scotsman, talking about, there it is, exactly what we've just been talking about, SNP under fire after same-sex marriage plan delay. Salmond stands firm over same-sex marriage plans. This is because the government has, of course, today also rejected calls from the Catholic Church to hold a referendum on the issue. Scottish Daily Mail, HSBC lets gangsters launder billions, it says. That's all for tonight. I'll be back tomorrow. Good night.